Intake manifold porting. It is one of the things that can add several horsepower to your engine, and if you're doing something like a big change with the size of the cylinder head and need to make the intake manifold match, is kind of required in order to make the ports work properly. Let's go over the what's, the whys, and the tools you use to do it. Now this particular manifold is an Oldsmobile small block Edelbrock Victor, and we need to match it to a larger port size, which the customer has already drawn out, and then I put the die chem on here and then retraced it and added the radiuses to the corners from what they marked on their engine. If you need to know how to do that to be able to do a proper port match, because this is not just gasket matching. Gasket matching, it only works if everything lines up exactly as designed. If any kind of machining's been done to the block or the heads, that changes, and typically the intake manifold will need to also be machined to make sure that the bolt holes line up nice, and then you'll need to either use the gasket as a reference point or find a way to be able to put it together and mark out exactly where the ports line up. For example on that would be if your port is smaller than the gasket you're using, you do not gasket match, because you don't want to make a bell mouth on the head to line it up, because you'll now be bell mouthing on the intake to match that, and your airspeed will be increasing and then hit a slowdown zone before accelerating again after it gets into the head. We don't want that. We want it to be nice and consistent all the way through. So if you've got a gasket that's way too big for the head, but that's the gasket you're using, you don't match to the gasket. You can use the gasket as a reference, but you need to use it as a trace out reference, and then if the port is, say, an 1/8 inch off of a wall of that gasket, you also leave that 1/8 inch off of the wall on the intake manifold from that gasket trace in order to make sure that you're matching the ports. I go over this process in one of my other videos. There'll be a little link tab thing here. You get reference that to show you how it's done. Like I said, the customer already did this, so we're not going to go over that in this video. The easiest gasket to see this on is our carb gasket, where we've got these little bit of ears where it's sticking out and all along this edge. This is just to true up that opening because it is an as-cast manifold, so we want to make sure that we're up to the right size. This is pretty minor considering your barrels off of a carburetor are much farther in, but it's just something nice to visually match it up. Our ports, on the other hand, is where we really need to take some material away. This manifold is designed for the Oldsmobile small block with the intention of it being opened up to an aftermarket head or a big block head port size. That's where all of this material up on top is largely coming from. Just a little bit off the bottom, but not a lot. And then you can see how we're edges are lined up here, and we got material to take off on the outside edge. And on the other end, it's not the same, it's a little bit different, but this is where the importance of tracing out where your ports are so that they can be matched manifold to head. On this particular manifold, because it's designed for the port matching to the bigger ports, we only need to go in about 1.5 inches because this port is smaller at the opening and then it expands fairly quick, so all we got to do is get that quick taper out. And the reason for that is the smaller port is to line up with a small block head for the Oldsmobile, and by opening it up it'll match up with the big block and the aftermarket heads. Why we want to do this is for the performance gains that we can get from porting the intake manifold. I've done independent testing on a dyno with be able to run back to back, pulling the intake, porting on one part of it, putting it back on the engine dyno, running it again, adjusting for any tuning that we need to in the process there. And typically doing a port match setup on an engine is going to be between 5 and 7 horsepower. And you'll end up getting another 5 to 10 based on plenum porting up in the top underneath the carburetor. And what we're trying to do there is just make a nice big radius leading into the runners as much as possible. And that just, it helps, makes the transition. We add a little bit of plenum volume If sometimes the engine likes that. Anytime if you want to know if the engine needs more plenum volume, typically the easiest thing to do is just throw a spacer on underneath the carburetor. If it picks up power, it wants more plenum volume. I've heavily modified one of these intakes even more drastically than anything we're going to do today with this to try to add plenum volume, and it pays dividends. But for what we're doing today, we're just going to be porting to match the runners up with what the cylinder head's going to be run and getting the plenum area smoothed out as nice as we can. The tools I'll be using are going to be my air grinder. This is a heavy duty unit from Dynabrade compared to what you might typically be using in a small garage. I like this extended style because you can get a hold of it in two places, and you can basically plant it in my shoulder and make it nice and stable for me. It also runs really smooth compared to something that's significantly cheaper. This is not a cheap grinder. I have a nice one because I do a lot. We also have our carbides that we're going to be using. I got a couple different styles here. The differences being shape and flute cut. For example, we have a coarse cut and a fine cut. The coarse is going to be for hogging out material faster, and the fine cut I'm actually going to use for more of a finisher and like both for surface finish style and for just getting the shape into the end. Also got one that's kind of a medium cross between the two. This is the one we'll probably end up using the most today. I also like having these flame cut style. This one's awfully beat up. I got some chunks of chips out of it, but we want this bigger diameter and this longer, large radius kind of thing that helps a lot for getting down in the runners and for doing the plenum area. I've got this pretty coarse cut, smaller diameter one. This will be for getting into the corners at the port entries. I also have a couple other ones of this that are actually meant for cast iron. They're a double cut style. I might go to those and just run them really slow to use as a fine cut also. The reason I don't want to do most of my roughing with those is because it'll clog up the flutes if you're using the cast iron style one. For complete finishing, we've got cartridge rolls and a mandrel. We'll be able to run different size and grits cartridge rolls as needed. Really, we're not too worried about doing anything fine. We are not polishing because this is an intake. We want a coarse, like 60 grit or coarser finish on it, which is why using this fine cut flute there, if I can keep everything under control where it's cutting nice and smooth, we'll actually just finish with this and we won't even cartridge roll. And if we really need to, we'll switch to this mandrel that has a slot in it. That's for wrapping sandpaper in, and then I can make my own custom barrel cartridge roll out of it just by using a roll of flat paper spun up in there. This is referred to as a flapper paper, and the nice thing is as it spins, it'll just fly out and it'll kind of just ride the surface, and it makes a really nice finish. Since we're doing an intake manifold, reach is typically an issue. I also have this extension where I can put a much shorter carbide into the end of this and extend the length. An important part of being able to do a good job is stability in the workpiece. I got my fixture set up, clamped down. It fits the intake manifold where it's really nice at this spot right here. So based on me having the grinder ready, I'm going to be able to work the lower side of this opening pretty well, flip it over, do that, and then it's good to have some blocks and other things around so that you can keep angling the piece to where it's going to fit nice, whereas right here I could be able to get in and start working these entries. However, I'm going to either want it supported on one or both sides just to keep it from wiggling around based on the vibration of the grinder. I like to double up on my hearing protection just because air grinders got a hell of a whine to them. Also want to make sure you're getting air tool oil in your grinder. It'll help it last a lot longer. I also have a speed adjuster. This helps a lot with air. If you got an electric one, they're tunable also. If you've got some kind of a rheostat kind of a setup, that's very, very important to be able to try to tune out any possible harmonics in the cutting bit. You can see I'm holding it tight into my shoulder. I'm locking my hand on the extended part, and I'm pulling my elbow tight to my body, because like we want our part to be rigid, but we also want us to be rigid too. You see it's got kind of a da-da-da-da-da chatter in there. Might be able to turn the speed a little bit and fix that. And because this cutter is older and dull, it's starting to gum up pretty quickly here, so we need to have some kind of lubrication to help keep the flutes clean on our grinder. One of my preferred methods of lubrication for the cutter is just ATF. Put it in a can so I can just dip my carbide and then go right back to grinding. Hopefully you can see what I'm changing here, or how high that casting comes up on this side. I'm knocking that down, and in the process of knocking that down, we're making a bigger radius into the opening of that port. Doing the same thing over here to a lesser extent because we got such a narrow opening on that side by comparison. But we're cutting the material down largely in this area to open up that entry and put a bigger radius on there, so as the air and fuel comes down from the top, it can go around the curve a lot easier. When it comes to the dividers, I'm not a fan of knife edging. I'm knocking down the casting flash because it's got some bumps and weird things in there, but we're just kind of rolling that edge over and blending it into what we're changing up here on the roof. At this point, it should start being fairly obvious about what's changing. The hard part is picking this up on camera is not the easiest thing to do. And you can tell a lot more about how your porting is going based on how it feels by running your finger over the surface and onto the ports. It's pretty easy to pick up whether or not you got bumps. And then if you shine a light in it in different ways, you can be able to tell whether or not you got high spots, low spots. It really comes down to kind of a feel and how good you can see with your eye. At this early stage, I'm not too concerned about my surface finish in here. I'm actually kind of okay with the way this burr is coming out, nice and rough. But I'm gonna wanna smooth off, especially on these dividers, the little high spots and stuff. And that's where switching over to a cartridge roll and probably ultimately the flapper paper is gonna come in later. Things are cruising right along. I switched over to this brand new fine cut. And this is the kind of surface finish you can get out of this. The camera picks up all the little light difference, but I can run my finger across this and I can feel just a little texture to it. There's still some high spots and low spots in there. But really, if you're after bang for the buck, as far as your time investment, I've got maybe half an hour of grind time in this plenum. And we've probably got at least a 5 horsepower gain right here over as cast. And we're probably 90% of the way there as far as gains we're going to have. I'm going to go back and I'm going to chase this with some cartridge rolls just to further smooth things out and take out a few more of the high spots and kind of level everything. And it makes it look nice. However, it does not need to be any smoother than what this little bit of a choppy carbide finish is. In fact, some guys prefer that. And that's because they seem to think or have found to prove that a dyno will make more power with it being a little choppier finish like that versus being cartridge rolled out. And these are pretty coarse cartridge rolls, like I said. This is about as fine of a cut as I'd want on any surface finish in the intake tract at all. If anything, this could be much rougher and put much deeper scratches in there to finish it out. But really, we're less worried about the surface finish and we're more worried about the shape and the way the air is moving. Here's an explanation of why we're not worried about that rough surface. Because if you mirror polish it, the air is going to be moving in two layers. There's the boundary layer that's attached to the wall of the port, and then there's the free-flowing air on top of it. And if you polished it smooth, it's kind of like air pushing, and it's these two separate layers of air moving together the way I'm using these rulers. So like it moves across the top, but it can make enough drag where it's sliding both of them, and that's actually creating more friction in the port, versus if we make a rough boundary layer, that bottom layer actually sticks to the port a little bit better, and it'll cause a rolling sensation in there, and it turns in more to like the air moving on top of little rollers, and it can move much easier and more stable that way, and that's where we can get a performance gain on the intake. So why wouldn't you do the same thing to the exhaust side? Well, you can, and actually in more recent times, that's where the theory is moving, where people are not trying to super mirror polish the exhaust side either. And a lot of the thinking back in the day with the polishing was that if the exhaust side is super smooth, it can't make carbon deposits and buildups that then impede airflow in the exhaust like you would see on a stock head that's not polished. And that still stands true. There's also with your super polishing, you do get a few more CFM out of it, and even on the intake side, you will see that CFM gain on the intake. But the problem is when you start introducing fuel to that. And that's why the rough finish, making those little rollers against the wall, is good on the intake, because it aids fuel atomization, especially in a carbureted application where you're adding fuel so far upstream. You need that fuel to still be atomized as it gets to the cylinder, versus like in direct injection, you're atomizing it right into the cylinder, or port injection, you're that much closer to the cylinder already when the fuel goes in the port, but it's still important. And anything we can do to increase fuel atomization, or rather keep it atomized, is going to increase power, because if the fuel doesn't stay atomized, it falls out of suspension in the air, and then it just puddles and runs along the runner on the floor or the wall or wherever it's stuck to. And it's not going to burn well when it gets in the cylinder. Now the secret with cartridge rolls is slow. If you go spinning these things wide open throttle and a die grinder, you're going to wear them out very, very quickly. As you can see, I've already cartridge rolled this area a little bit, and I just went over it real light. Now you can see all of the high and low spots that it's hit in there, and that's what we're going to come back and smooth out with the cartridge roll. A few guys that get very, very serious about their porting will actually go through cartridge roll, possibly even mirror polish, to make sure that they can find any and all high spots before going back over it with a carbide to rough it back up. And that's just a matter of making sure that everything's as flat and true as they can get it before putting on that rough surface finish. But I'm going to be good with just what the cartridge roll gets, so we're just going to dust everything here in this plenum and get it smoothed out before moving on to the runner openings. It only took me a few minutes to cartridge roll. That's the nice thing about doing the work and getting it as good as you can with your carbides ahead of time, is cartridge rolling and finishing the port out go very quickly. I still want to do some stuff with the divider here. I want to smooth it out a little bit. The camera's going to struggle to stay in focus though. Still want to do some stuff with the divider here, and this is where the flapper paper comes in. It also makes a nice uniform shape. So that just slots into this mandrel, and then we can twist it, and now I can roll myself a square cartridge roll. I could slide it out and make kind of a tapered one. But what happens here is as it spins, this edge is going to flap up and drag flat across, and it helps level things out and make a nice uniform finish. I'm going to use it on top of this divider so that it'll kind of flip over it back. See how quickly that knocked down any imperfections I had there? Well, I can see it. I don't know if you guys can. Yeah, it's really hard for this camera to focus on it, but I'm gonna go ahead and run the flapper paper through, and we'll take another closer look after. This side is just cartridge rolled. This side's got the flapper paper. You can notice how much more uniform it is. Are we getting a performance gain? Probably not from that. However, it does make it look a lot nicer. It's much more presentable. It's also still making sure that we got our nice scratches in there. But the big thing is it's helping level out the surface, which, you know, when you start looking for every last little bit, that does make a difference in performance. It's about being uniform and making sure that we're getting the same amount of air to all the cylinders. That's why we're doing the porting, is to try to make sure that we're getting even distribution to everything. And it's just a matter of taking that time to make sure that we can do it. It's also, when everything gets flattened out, it's a lot easier to see if at some point you missed a big bump in there, where you can't always see whether something's flat with a carbide surface. And sometimes it's not even that easy to see it with a cartridge rolled one. But when you flapper paper and all of a sudden you're making the surface uniform enough to really catch the light and you see the imperfections, that's when you can go back and try to level everything out there. The other nice thing about the cartridge roll is because we can wrap it off the end of the mandrel, we could push it into something where it curves up in the back. That'd be like on the intake bowl coming in from the flange on a head. You know, where you want to run up and uniform out any bumps or lumps you might have in that radius. Cartridge roll can get a lot of that, but then you go to flapper paper, it'll really just kind of ride the surface and knock down the high spots, and it can really finish out your port job. Moving on to the flanges, this is where we got a lot more material to take out. Luckily, it's more of kind of like a wedge. I only got to go in an inch and a half to mate up to the runner that's already in the manifold. So we're just going to start by roughing out as much as I can right here. I do not want to just go roughing straight to my scribe lines because it's so easy to overshoot them, especially with a rougher. So I'm going to try to get it kind of close, and I'm going to want to switch over to a fine tooth bit or be slowing the grinder down, going really slow to bring it up to the lines. That way we don't overshoot, because we'd rather be a little bit undersized on the intake manifold than the cylinder head than to be the other way around. And the reason for that is the air coming out of the intake manifold, if it's smaller, can pass right into the head, no restriction. If it's bigger, all of a sudden there's a ledge that the air can crash into, and then it's got to like almost like water going over the edge of the cup. It's got to like fall over that, and that's actually going to reduce the size of the central air that's actually, you know, not your boundary layer that's moving through. It's actually going to restrict it, even though we're talking about bigger sizes, because of the way that air is crashing into a wall and then folding in, it's blocking more air coming in. So we don't want to do that. So if you're unsure or just trying to err on the side of caution, always leave the intake manifold small of the head. Since I'm only going to be working very close to the flange, I'm going to opt for a shorter carbide. It'll be more stable. This one's a flat barrel with a rounded nose. The nose is pretty beat up on this one already, but I'm not going to be cutting with the nose. I want to be knocking away the bulk of this material to the top and bottom and working it a little bit, at which point I'm going to switch to my larger flame shape, because this gives me multiple diameters through the length, and then I can use it to work in the corners and still flatten things out, but then the radius also helps with these end runners where we gotta start curving back more, where I can blend it into the actual runner nice and easy, before I'll finally switch over to the fine cut carbide again, and then we should be ready to cartridge roll and flapper paper just like we did in the plenum. Happy with how that first runner came out. If you can see in the video clip there, I left just an eyebrow around my scribe just to the inside, so we're just a hair smaller, and I'd rather end up doing that than going a little too far. It just means we got a little extra wiggle room. I still got to just chase the deburr knife around this thing just to take the sharp edge off. With the first runner done, I just got to finish the other 7, and then this intake manifold will be done. These were just the 2 big things, was getting the runner's port matched and the plenum. For what this intake manifold is already as cast, and for the application that's going on, there's absolutely no need to be porting all the way up the runners, because they're fairly straight. They got a nice taper to them already. We're just trying to make sure that we're getting air in and out a little bit better than the way it was cast, and it should be worth at least 15 horsepower on the dyno. So additional takeaways from this are going to be your carbides. If you're looking at a DIY kit and it doesn't have carbides, which most of them don't that I've seen, they're only cartridge rolls and maybe some stones if you're lucky. And the stones are really only for doing cast iron type stuff. I would use stones in place of cartridge rolls for the most part, because they cut a little faster and they leave a nice finish. But carbides, if you don't use the cheap little $10 4-pack for welding or whatever, even if you get an extension, I mean, they might do okay, but they're really not going to be great carbide quality. Buy stuff that's meant for porting, or at least get the couple of shapes that you really need to have, which are going to be, if you're doing like I just did in this intake, one of them barrel ones with a rounded nose is a good option for doing the roughing, not for finishing anything, just for roughing. The SE, which is an oval style in the porting world, that's a great one for just a general purpose all-arounder. And then I like the flame ones, especially in a bigger diameter, because the bigger the diameter is and the closer they match to the runner that you're trying to make, the less work it is. You can think about that like, you're trying to make something level and flat. Well, the bigger diameter that the carbide is, the flatter it's going to be as it's cutting, versus if you were using something much smaller diameter and having to move it around more, like the contact patch is a lot smaller, and therefore it'll be quicker with the larger diameter. But you can't always get away with that. You gotta, adjust for size as needed. And this is all just stuff you gotta learn. I probably have north of 1,500 hours holding a grinder in my hand, if not over 2,000 by now. I mean, it's been 15 years or more that I've been porting on stuff. And I may not do it as much as I used to, but I still do it quite a bit. And it's just a matter of developing a skill. A lot of the big thing with doing a good job is more about making sure your workpiece is sturdy and that you're holding the grinder sturdy, because if you're trying to do anything out in front of you like this, you're just going to have that sucker bouncing around because the carbide's going to grab and it's going to buck, and then all of a sudden, and you have no control over it. It's just going to bounce around, and if you're using a 6-inch long carbide, you're probably going to have bent it by then. You know, versus, you know, hold it in tight, make sure you're squared up nice, as rigid as you can get, and you'll do a much better job on your porting. I think I'll throw this video out as kind of like a test the waters. I do have a couple of engine assembly videos with the Oldsmobile small block already out there if you're interested in some of that stuff as far as engine related. However, I'm kicking around the idea of doing like perhaps a classroom style cylinder head porting or engine design and development type of videos. Leave a comment if you think that that stuff would interest you. It's a ton of work to put into something like that, and I'd want to make sure that there's going to be enough interest for it to be worthwhile on that. I used to teach those types of classes back when I was at Joe Mondella Racing Engines in Crossville, Tennessee, which was the Mondella Technical School before that. I ended up working there after Joe had passed away, and we ended up teaching porting classes and engine building classes along the lines of that. So I'm thinking videos along those lines. Porting is only going to be able to go so far because, to have the camera, I got to be able to see what I'm doing, and the camera can't really be in place of my head to really see what I'm doing. And, and then whether or not anything's going to even be in focus at that point in time anyway, it's really hard to say there. But we can cover the basics and the techniques and like what you're trying to accomplish with all that too. So let me know.